I still remember that night vividly, the smell of damp earth mingling with the crisp autumn air as my boots crunched through the underbrush. The forest had always been my escape, a place where the world's chaos melted into the whispers of rustling leaves and the distant hoots of owls. But this time was different. I had heard the stories, my grandmother's trembling voice warning me as a child never to stray too far from the beaten paths, never to be out there after dark. She called it the Skinwalker's domain. I laughed it off then, as any naive teenager would. But those words clawed their way back into my mind as the sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding fiery hues through the skeletal branches. The purpose of my hike was simple: solitude, a break from the incessant demands of modern life. But now, with night swallowing the forest whole, I felt anything but alone. My flashlight cast long, trembling beams ahead, but the dark seemed to breathe, encroaching on the edges of the light. It began subtly, a twig snapping too close, the faint sound of footsteps not my own. I paused, the silence so oppressive that my heartbeat seemed to echo in my ears. "It's just an animal," I muttered under my breath, trying to quell the rising dread. But then, the footsteps mimicked mine. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved, perfectly synchronized. I turned sharply, sweeping the flashlight in a frantic arc, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A tall, gaunt figure with eyes that reflected the light like a predator's. Its face was wrong, stretched and pale, with lips too thin to conceal a set of impossibly sharp teeth. Panic surged, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure was gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained, clinging to me like a second skin. I tried to shake it off, quickening my pace, muttering rationalizations. A trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't right tonight. The sounds of nocturnal life, crickets, frogs, rustling leaves, had fallen deathly silent. My breath fogged in the unnaturally cold air, each exhale a visible reminder of my fear. Then came the voice, soft at first, but unmistakable. My grandmother's voice calling my name from deeper in the woods. "Come here, child." It beckoned, sweet and familiar, though tinged with an undertone that made my stomach churn. My grandmother had been dead for years. "No," I whispered, shaking my head violently. "This isn't real." But the voice persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Why are you running? Don't you recognize me?" The voice warped, becoming guttural and alien, a twisted parody of her comforting tone. I ran. Adrenaline pumped through my veins, but the forest seemed endless, the trees stretching taller and closing in like skeletal hands reaching for me. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. But the faster I ran, the closer the footsteps came, heavy and deliberate, no longer mimicking mine but chasing with inhuman determination. My legs burned, lungs heaving as the flashlight flickered. When it finally died, I was plunged into absolute darkness. That's when I heard it again, breathing impossibly close, ragged and wet. I turned, and it was there, standing mere feet away. The thing that wore my grandmother's face, or something like it, stretched and distorted, its mouth opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of teeth that gleamed like shards of glass. It didn't speak this time, but its eyes told me everything. Hunger, malice, a predatory glee that rooted me in place. It lunged, and I screamed, swinging the dead flashlight in blind desperation. Somehow, I connected, and the creature hissed, a sound so high-pitched and piercing that it felt like needles driving into my skull. I ran again, tears streaming down my face, until I burst into a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. There I saw them, figures like the one behind me, their twisted forms lingering just beyond the tree line, watching. They didn't pursue, but their presence was a threat, a promise. I collapsed, shivering and delirious, until the faint glow of dawn broke through the trees. By then, the figures were gone, but their memory lingered like a sickness in my mind. I never went back to that forest. Even now, as I write this, I feel their eyes on me, watching from the shadows of memory. They let me go, but I know it wasn't mercy. It was a warning, or worse, an invitation. I never intended to speak of what happened that night in the canyon, but the memories won't let me sleep. Even now, years later, I feel the weight of its eyes on me whenever I'm alone. It started as a trip meant to clear my head, a spontaneous escape to the wilderness after weeks of suffocating monotony at my dead-end job. I had always loved the isolation of the desert canyons, the way the sandstone walls towered over me, ancient and indifferent, and the way the stars painted the sky with a brilliance I couldn't find in the city. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my car at the edge of a gravel trail, and packed enough supplies for an overnight stay. The plan was simple: hike into the canyon, set up camp, and spend a night under the stars. As I descended into the winding paths of red rock, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The air grew cooler, and the silence of the canyon became a presence, heavy and oppressive. First, it was peaceful. I found a flat area near the base of a towering cliff, pitched my tent, and started a small fire. The glow of the flames was comforting, their crackling a reminder of the warmth and safety they provided. I ate my meal in quiet solitude, staring into the endless expanse of the night sky. But then, just as the last light of the fire began to die, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, faint but unmistakable, echoing off the canyon walls. My first thought was a coyote or a mountain lion, both of which were common in the area, but something about the sound was off. It didn't seem animal. It was deeper, resonating in a way that made my skin crawl. I froze, listening intently, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The growl came again, this time closer, accompanied by the sound of shuffling footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, the beam trembling as my hand shook. The shadows danced wildly against the rocks, but I saw nothing. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice echoed back to me, brittle and small. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, as though the canyon itself was holding its breath. And then I saw it, two glowing eyes reflecting the weak beam of my flashlight, staring at me from the edge of the firelight. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and they didn't blink or move, just stared, unblinking and predatory. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking, but the thing didn't move. Instead, it stepped forward, just enough for the firelight to catch its outline. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, pale and mottled, and its face, God, its face, looked like it had been stitched together from pieces that didn't quite fit. The mouth was too wide, the nose barely a bump, and the eyes, those awful glowing eyes, were sunken deep into its skull. It cocked its head to one side, as if studying me, and then it smiled. The smile stretched across its face in a way that no human mouth ever could, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. I stumbled backward, tripping over my pack, as the thing let out a sound that was half laughter, half snarl. It began to move, slowly at first, dragging its legs in a jerky, unnatural gait, but as I scrambled to my feet, it lunged. I didn't think, I just ran. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand as I sprinted through the canyon, the shadows closing in around me. I could hear it behind me, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, but no matter how fast I ran, the sound stayed the same distance away, as if it was toying with me. The narrow walls of the canyon seemed to stretch and twist, the paths that had been so familiar in daylight now a maze of darkness and dread. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop until I reached a narrow crevice in the rock, barely wide enough to squeeze through. I ducked inside, pressing myself against the cold stone, and killed the flashlight, plunging myself into complete darkness. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to muffle my ragged breathing. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, it had lost me. But then came the whisper, my own voice, distorted and mocking, calling my name from the darkness outside. "Come out," it said, dragging the words out in a sing-song tone. "I see you." I clenched my teeth, fighting the urge to scream. The whispering continued, growing louder, overlapping itself in a cacophony of voices that all sounded like me. It was in my head, under my skin, and I felt like I was losing my mind. And then the footsteps resumed, slow and deliberate, coming closer to the crevice. I pressed myself deeper into the rock, but there was nowhere to go. The thing stopped just outside, and I could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating weight that seemed to seep into the stone. "Found you," it said, its voice a guttural growl. I shut my eyes, bracing for the end, but instead, there was a scraping sound, like claws raking against the rock. The thing didn't enter the crevice, it couldn't fit, but it didn't leave either. It stayed there, breathing heavily, its raspy exhalations filling the narrow space. I don't know how long I stayed there, too terrified to move, but eventually, the breathing stopped and the oppressive weight lifted. When I finally dared to peek outside, the first light of dawn was creeping over the canyon walls, and the thing was gone. I ran back to my car, not caring about the supplies I left behind, and didn't stop until I was miles away from the canyon. I haven't been back since, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear that voice again, whispering my name, and I wonder if I truly escaped, or if it's still out there, waiting for me to return. I've made peace with the fact that no one will believe me, but I need to tell the story because the silence is killing me. It began on a cold November night when my friends convinced me to join them on a camping trip near Black Hollow Ridge. I was hesitant. I'd heard the stories whispered around campfires as a kid, tales of hunters and hikers who vanished or returned shattered, mumbling incoherent warnings about the thing in the woods. But peer pressure got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was crammed into an old SUV with 3 others, the scent of gas station snacks mingling with the dampness of the chilly evening air. The drive was filled with laughter and bravado, all of us joking about the Skinwalker legends as though we were immune to the fear they carried. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was just a faint glow on the horizon, painting the treetops in streaks of crimson and gold. We hiked for miles, the dense forest swallowing us in a labyrinth of gnarled branches and shadowy undergrowth, until we found a clearing to set up camp. The fire roared to life, casting flickering shapes against the towering pines, and we settled into a rhythm of banter and storytelling. It wasn't until well past midnight, when the fire had dwindled to embers and the cold began to creep in, that I noticed it, the unnatural stillness. The forest, which had been alive with the chirps of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves, had fallen completely silent. My friends didn't seem to notice at first, lost in their own conversations, but then we all heard it. A cry, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the woods. It sounded like a woman, desperate and pained, but there was something off about it, a hollow resonance that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Probably just an animal," Mike said, though his voice lacked conviction. But then it came again, closer this time, and it wasn't just a cry. It was a call, my name stretched out in a haunting wail that sent a shiver racing down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The others nodded, their faces pale in the dying firelight. "That's not funny," Sarah said, glaring at Mike, but he swore it wasn't him. Then, as if on cue, the voice called again, but this time it wasn't just my name. It was Sarah's too, followed by Matt's and Mike's, each one distorted and wrong, like the voice of someone who had heard our names but didn't understand how to say them. Panic set in and we huddled closer to the fire, gripping whatever we could use as weapons, knives, sticks, even the lid of a pot. "We need to leave," Matt said, but no one moved. Then the footsteps began, heavy and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves just beyond the firelight. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it into the darkness, the beam trembling as it swept over the trees. For a moment, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks on me, but then I saw it. A figure standing between the trees, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its joints bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over its bones, and its face, if you could call it a face, was a grotesque amalgamation of features, as though it had been pieced together from different beings. It smiled at me, a slow, deliberate grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. "We're leaving," Sarah said, her voice breaking, and we scrambled to douse the fire and pack what we could. But as we turned to leave, the figure moved, stepping into the edge of the clearing. Its movements were jerky, like a puppet on strings, and with every step, it called our names again, each one more distorted than the last. We ran. The forest was a blur as we tore through the trees, the sound of its footsteps following us, faster and closer with every passing second. It was playing with us, letting us think we could escape, but no matter how far we ran, it was always just behind us. I tripped, falling hard onto the cold ground, and when I looked up, it was there, towering over me. Its eyes, black voids that seemed to swallow the light, locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything stopped. It leaned down, its face inches from mine, and it whispered in a voice that was almost human but filled with a guttural, inhuman growl. "Run!" Somehow, I found the strength to get up, my legs numb with terror, and I ran until I saw the faint glow of dawn breaking through the trees. When we finally reached the SUV, breathless and shaking, we didn't speak. We drove in silence, each of us too afraid to acknowledge what had happened. Weeks later, I found strange scratches on the walls of my apartment, long and deep, as though made by claws. Sometimes, late at night, I hear my name again, whispered from the shadows, and I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, and one day, it'll come back. I should have listened to the old woman at the gas station, her cracked voice trembling as she warned me about the hills surrounding the reservation. "Things that walk but aren't alive," she had muttered, her sunken eyes boring into mine as she handed me my change. But I was a skeptic, a city boy who thought legends were just that, stories told to scare kids or keep tourists in check. The hills were supposed to be my escape, a place to clear my mind after my mother's funeral, where the memories of her pain and my guilt wouldn't follow. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and my journal, and drove until the gravel roads turned to dirt trails, deep into the wilderness where no cell signal could reach. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting the jagged peaks in fiery hues, and the wind carried an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I set up camp at the base of a towering ridge, the horizon swallowing the last light, and as darkness fell, I felt an unease I couldn't shake, like being watched by something unseen. The first night passed uneventfully, save for the howling of coyotes that seemed to circle my camp, their cries oddly synchronized, almost rhythmic. But the second night was different. I had spent the day hiking, the trail winding through valleys and cliffs that seemed untouched by time. But by dusk, I noticed something peculiar. My footprints, which I'd left in the dry dirt that morning, were no longer alone. A second set, larger and deeper, followed mine exactly, as though someone or something had been retracing my steps. My stomach churned, and I told myself it was just my imagination. But as the moon rose, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable, carried on the wind. My flashlight flickered as I shone it into the surrounding woods, the beam cutting through the oppressive blackness, but I saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, and I retreated to my tent, clutching the hunting knife I'd brought more for comfort than practicality. Sleep came in fitful bursts, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and distorted whispers that seemed to echo the voice of my mother. I woke with a start sometime after midnight, the tent eerily still, the wind gone. At first, I thought it was silence that had jolted me awake, but then I heard it. A scratching sound, faint and deliberate, moving slowly around the perimeter of the tent. My breath hitched, and I gripped the knife tighter, the blade trembling in my hand. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural laugh. Deep, mocking, and unmistakably human. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice betraying my fear, but the only response was the sound of something heavy shifting outside. Summoning what little courage I had, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. That's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a man crouched on all fours, its back arched unnaturally high, but as the light caught its face, I realized it wasn't human. Its skin was ashen, stretched taut over its skeletal frame, and its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. Its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, jagged teeth bared, as it cocked its head, mimicking the way a curious dog might. I froze, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of it, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then it spoke, its voice a distorted echo of my own. "Lost are we." The words sent a wave of nausea through me, and I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. Darkness enveloped me, but I could hear it moving, the sound of bones cracking and joints popping as it rose to its full height. It was taller than any man should be, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with broken strings. I bolted from the tent, the knife clutched in one hand, the darkness disorienting me as I ran blindly through the woods. Branches clawed at my skin, and my lungs burned with each frantic breath. But the thing followed, its laughter echoing around me, mocking and relentless. No matter how fast I ran, it was always just behind me, its heavy footsteps keeping pace. I tripped over a root, crashing hard to the ground, and as I scrambled to my feet, it emerged from the shadows, its grin wider than before. "You can't run," it hissed, its voice layered with overlapping tones, some familiar, others alien. Desperation took over, and I lashed out with the knife, the blade slicing through the air uselessly. It laughed, a guttural, choking sound, and lunged. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of pain, the cold press of the ground against my back, and the sound of my own screams swallowed by the night. When I woke, it was morning, and I was lying at the edge of the ridge, my tent and belongings gone. My clothes were torn, and my skin was marked with deep scratches that burned with every movement. I stumbled back to my car, the journey taking hours, my mind replaying the encounter in fragments that didn't make sense. Even now, back in the safety of civilization, I can't escape the feeling that it's still out there, watching, waiting. At night, I hear the faint scratching at my windows, the distorted laughter echoing in my dreams, and I know that the hills took more than my peace. They took a part of me, and someday they'll come back for the rest. Started as a dare, like all terrible ideas do. My cousin Luke had been egging me on for weeks, teasing me for being too much of a city boy to handle the wild. "Spend one night alone in the Gorge," he said, "and I'll never call you soft again." The Gorge was infamous, not for its beauty, but for the stories tied to it. Legends of people disappearing, bizarre sightings, and hushed warnings from locals about things that didn't belong in our world. I scoffed at the tales, chalking them up to overactive imaginations and campfire embellishments. So I packed my gear, determined to prove Luke and everyone else wrong. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the dense forest in hues of gold and deepening shadows. My hike in was uneventful, though the eerie quiet of the woods was unsettling. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just silence so heavy it felt like a presence. I set up camp near a stream that snaked through the gorge, the sound of water the only thing breaking the stillness. And as night fell, I sat by the fire, trying to shake the unease that gnawed at me. Hours passed, and the fire dwindled to glowing embers, but I couldn't sleep. There was a tension in the air, a charged sensation that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper, faint but clear, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. "Come closer," it said, the voice rasping and wet, as though dragged from a throat and used to speaking. My blood turned to ice, but I told myself it was the wind, even though there was no breeze. The voice came again, closer this time, calling my name in a tone that sounded almost familiar but twisted. Wrong. My flashlight flickered to life as I scanned the dark, the beam bouncing off trees and catching glimpses of shapes that didn't belong. Long, thin limbs moving unnaturally fast, too far from the ground to be human. Panic surged, and I retreated into my tent, zipping it shut as if nylon could shield me from whatever was out there. The whispers grew louder, circling my campsite, and then the scratching began, long, deliberate drags of claws across the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, clutching the hunting knife I'd brought, praying the thing would go away, but then it laughed, a hollow, grating sound that made my stomach churn. "You can't hide," it rasped, and I froze as the zipper began to slide down, slowly, deliberately. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the opening, and that's when I saw it. A face staring back at me, its features grotesquely stretched, a horrifying mimicry of my own. Its eyes were pits of darkness, its grin impossibly wide, revealing jagged teeth that seemed to pulse with a sickly, pale light. It was wearing my face, my voice, but warped beyond recognition. I screamed, lunging with the knife, and the thing recoiled, its laughter echoing through the night as it retreated into the trees. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I grabbed my pack and ran, the forest a maze of shadows and shifting shapes. No matter how fast I moved, the whispers followed, growing louder, more distorted, until they filled my head with a cacophony of voices. My mother, my cousin, my own, all twisted into a mocking symphony of terror. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I couldn't stop. Just as dawn began to break, I stumbled into the parking lot where my car was waiting, collapsing against the driver's side door. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and as I started the engine, I saw it standing at the edge of the treeline, watching. It was taller now, its limbs longer, its grin wider, and as I sped away, its voice followed, carried on the wind. "See you soon." That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, the whispers haven't stopped. They come at night, seeping through the walls of my apartment, scratching at my windows, calling my name with my own voice. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of it in reflective surfaces. A shadow standing behind me, its grin impossibly wide, its eyes voids of endless hunger. I've tried to tell people, but they think I'm crazy. Maybe I am, but I know it's still out there, waiting for the moment when I can't run anymore, when I'm too weak to resist. And when that day comes, I know it won't just take my face. It'll take everything I am.